April 17th, 1945. 10:47 a.m. Southampton Docks, Hampshire. Cloud breaks over grey water. Elizabeth Wagner stepped down the gangway onto British soil, her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform stiff with salt spray and 3 weeks of fear. Her hands trembled from the certainty that she was about to die. Around her, 67 other women shuffled forward in silence. Speaking drew attention. Attention meant selection. Selection meant a bullet. But the British sergeant at the ramp's foot simply checked a clipboard, nodded to a translator, and said something incomprehensible. Medical inspection first, then tea. Elizabeth looked at the woman beside her. Neither understood. The sergeant gestured toward a canvas tent where 2 nurses waited, their Red Cross armbands vivid against khaki. No rifles, no dogs, no screaming. One nurse smiled, a smile that would undo everything Elizabeth thought she knew about strength. For 2 years, Elizabeth and her colleagues had absorbed a consistent narrative. Capture by the Allies meant humiliation, starvation, forced labor, until death. The propaganda films were explicit. British and American soldiers were depicted as barbaric, driven by vengeance. Women prisoners would fare even worse. Girls who fell into enemy hands simply disappeared. The medical tent smelled of antiseptic and boiled wool. A British doctor examined Elizabeth's hands, calloused from signal equipment, and asked in halting German if she had injuries. He checked her eyes, her throat, then nodded toward a chair where a nurse offered her a tin mug. Hot tea, real tea, with half a spoon of sugar dissolved in it. Elizabeth held the mug but didn't drink. It had to be a trick. Poison, perhaps, or a test. The nurse noticed her hesitation and sipped from her own cup. "It's just tea, love. You're safe now." Safe. The word landed like a foreign object. Elizabeth drank. The warmth spread through her chest, and for the first time in months, her hands stopped shaking. Within a week, the women were assigned to agricultural labor. Britain's farms were critically short-handed, and German POWs became essential to the 1945 harvest. Elizabeth's group was sent to a dairy cooperative in Shropshire. 12 women tasked with milking, mucking stalls, and processing milk under the supervision of a skeptical farmer named Mr. Thompson. He was 63, lean, and spoke rarely. On the first morning, he showed them the milking parlor, demonstrated the equipment once, and said, "You'll work 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. You'll be paid in camp script. You'll be treated fairly if you work fairly." Then he left them to it. Elizabeth had never milked a cow before. Neither had most of the others, but they learned quickly, driven by the understanding that failure meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was more frightening than hard work. By week's end, Mr. Thompson grunted his approval. "You'll do." It was the first compliment Elizabeth had received from an enemy. The work was honest. The supervision was firm but not cruel, and at day's end they returned to camp with enough energy to write letters, mend clothes, or sit by the stove with mugs of tea. The mug became Elizabeth's anchor, proof this strange new reality wasn't a dream. 3 weeks into the work detail, Mrs. Thompson appeared at the dairy with a basket of scones still warm from the oven. She set them on the workbench and said simply, "Tea time." Elizabeth hesitated. Mrs. Thompson poured tea, added milk, and handed the first cup to Elizabeth. "Go on, then. It won't bite." They ate in silence, POWs on one side, Mrs. Thompson on the other. But the silence was different now, less wary, more human. Over the following months, small gestures accumulated. A borrowed coat when rain turned cold, an invitation to Sunday dinner, a birthday cake for one of the younger women. None of it was required. It was the quiet decision, repeated daily, to see enemies as people. In July, one of the women, a signals technician named Anna, developed a severe infection from a cut sustained during farm work. The camp medical officer immediately ordered hospitalization. She was transferred to the local civilian hospital in Shrewsbury, where she shared a ward with British patients. The nurses treated her wound with the same care they gave everyone else. Anna recovered fully within 10 days. When she returned to camp, she was subdued. One evening she told Elizabeth, "The nurse asked me if I had family. I said, 'Yes, a brother.' She asked if I'd heard from him. I said, 'No.' She said, 'I hope he's safe.' And she meant it." Anna paused, staring into her tea. "I don't understand them." Elizabeth understood the confusion. The propaganda had prepared them for cruelty, which could be endured with hatred intact. It hadn't prepared them for decency, which demanded a reckoning. Christmas 1945 arrived with snow and peculiar tension. The war in Europe had ended in May, but repatriation was delayed by logistics and the sheer scale of displaced persons. On Christmas Eve, the camp chaplain organized a carol service. The chaplain opened with Silent Night, and the British Guards joined in. Then, to Elizabeth's shock, he switched to German. Steel knocked. The women sang tentatively at first, then with gathering strength. When the service ended, the chaplain distributed small parcels, a chocolate bar, wool socks, biscuits. "From the parish," he said. "They wanted you to have something." Elizabeth held the chocolate and thought of Christmases before the war. She cried quietly, and no one stopped her. By spring 1946, the camp had established a small library. Elizabeth borrowed a copy of Pride and Prejudice and labored through it with a dictionary, fascinated by the ordinariness of the world it described. A music club formed. The camp commandant allowed practice twice weekly. They sang German songs, British folk songs, even American standards. Not every guard was patient. In August, a young British corporal lost his temper when one of the women spoke back during a work assignment. He raised his voice, stepped too close. The camp sergeant intervened immediately, pulled the corporal aside, and dressed him down in clipped, furious English. The corporal was reassigned the next day. The message was clear. The barbed wire was the punishment. Cruelty was not policy. By late 1946, restrictions had loosened. Elizabeth and several others were allowed supervised walks beyond the camp perimeter on Sunday afternoons. Eventually, supervision was dropped. They could have run, but where would they go? Germany was rubble, repatriation was coming, and truthfully, life in the camp had settled into something bearable. Late at night, lying in her bunk with the mug of evening tea cooling beside her, Elizabeth turned the question over. If the propaganda about Allied cruelty was false, demonstrably false, what else had been a lie? Repatriation began in early 1947. Elizabeth stayed until autumn, working the harvest one last time, attending a final Sunday dinner with the Thompson family. She accepted a small parcel for the journey, tea, biscuits, and a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, with a note tucked inside. Remember that decency is always a choice. Safe travels. Write if you can. She did write, for 30 years. Elizabeth rebuilt her life in Hamburg, married a teacher, raised 2 children. She kept the tin mug on her kitchen shelf, dented and dull. When her children asked about it, she would say only, "It's from England." It reminds me that people are complicated. The war had taught millions that strength was violence. But in a camp in Shropshire, in a dairy cooperative, in a farmhouse kitchen, a different lesson was taught through small, repeated acts of restraint. Elizabeth learned that strength is not what you do to your enemies when you have power over them. Strength is what you refuse to do